Council and on its executive committee. And we've had a vigorous and morning panel in focusing and we really have a terrific panel. We're going to hear from each of them, and let me say just a few brief words of introduction about them. I'll pose some questions to them, and then we're going to spend a lot of time in back and forth with you and with your questions. We'll first be hearing in the queue from Mr. Ron van Rooyen, on the end there, Mission Chief for Ukraine at the International Monetary Fund. And after him, we will be hearing from Ms. Caroline Vicini, who is the Minister, Deputy Head of Delegation of the Delegation of the European Union, and she happens to be chargé d'affaires at this particular time. And then we'll hear from Dr. Anders Aslan, who all of you know is a senior fellow at the Dinu Patricio Eurasia Center and someone who has spent a long time working on Ukraine's economy. I may, which is, you know, what do you in economy?
Including with some questions regarding.
Him, by the way, at the back, yes? Okay, yes, they have thumbs up.
Does it work, or?
People said if you, but go ahead.
But what we essentially is that are 2.5% next year. I mean, that's not enough to catch up. I mean, so the pace of economic growth needs to be substantially accelerated. And what do you need to do for that? And I think there, the pace of the recovery, I mean, the recovery that we fortunately start seeing, depends very much on the determination, on the pace of implementing structural reforms, where the authorities have made a start over the last 2-3 years, supported also very broadly by the international community. More that has to be done, and particularly also if one of the key measures that the central bank departed from its previous policies of having a fixed exchange rate, and so they let the exchange rate float. And if we look at where Ukraine stands in terms of competitiveness, we see that pretty much regained a lot of its competitiveness. And if we look at labor productivity and how that relates to the level of the exchange rate, we think that the exchange rate is more or less currently at an appropriate level, and we actually see some room for some real appreciation. But we also labor productivity compare that to other countries in Eastern Europe, and that begs the question: why is that? And again, if we make a comparison to other countries in the region, what we see is that private investment has been quite obvious. We come to the big issue of the investment climate in Ukraine. Again, I mean the large backlog in structural reforms, the still very much incomplete transition to a full-fledged market economy, that is only still beginning, and as I said before, still with a long way to go. Part of that is also the issue of these have started to make progress by putting new institutions to adjourn there. I mean, this is only the beginning. More to be done. Make Ukraine a more attractive place to invest has been very low. So the country needs to attract more investment to grow faster. Some bursts. And I said, I mean, GDP is at about level of 20% of the EU. If you were to that as we see years, is picking up to something like 4 or 5%. If the average growth rate in Central and in Eastern Europe is going to be projected at the moment of about 1.5–2% of 1.5–2%. For that, I mean, everything else about this level of growth for about 30–40 plus. I mean, with the rest of Eastern Europe. that they move fast with implementing structural reforms and also more inclusive economic.
Skepticism because our sector haven't seen certain structural reforms. Is that so?
No,
economy?
it's. I mean, indeed, and there. I mean, I need to emphasize it's no small feats what they have realized. I mean, they come from a very deep economic recession. At the end of 2013, early 2014, we had a fiscal deficit, if you include the energy sector, of 10% of GDP. Have been over the last 2 years a current account deficit of, and we project about 2.5%. The fiscal deficit, including the energy, to come about at 2.5% of GDP by the end of this year. So this is an enormous, tremendous, dramatic reduction in these imbalances. I mean, and for that they deserve a lot of credit. The increase in the gas and heating, a major step. Ukraine appointed and put in place independent anti-corruption prosecutors. Recently, we have seen the launch and implementation of the electronic asset declaration system. That was, despite attempts to undermine, successfully that out. But it needs to continue, and I think there also what we have seen in Ukraine's history is a series of repeated crises, economic crisis, and the country has always been good in doing what it needs to do to come out of the crisis, but then to sustain that reform momentum in the past has been more of a challenge. Now, fortunately, what we see, I mean, the current government, I mean, the previous government and the current government, they continue with this process of the reforms, and so they are committed to continue with the reforms. But yes, it does need to go faster. Take for example an area of state-owned enterprise. Ukraine is very large state-owned enterprise. Some of them basically different. The government tried the first plant that failed. That was the second time that this tender failed, and this was only the first company out of a universe of close to state-owned enterprise sold in one way or another. So yes, a lot to be done. And it needs to be.
The IMF didn't continue with funding, as you know, for this round. So given the picture that you've just given us, why? Why is it?
I don't think it's fair to say that the IMF has not to give funding. We completed the review after a delay, but we completed earlier this morning. The IMF program is worth about $17 billion, of which we now have disbursed more than $7 billion in the last year and a half. So we've provided substantial funding, I would say, to Ukraine. Now the timing of when we complete reviews, it's not surprising that there are delays. I mean, some of the things that we ask for are difficult. The previous review took a year to complete, but there was also a change in government in the meantime, which delayed the process. So we were in Kiev in productive discussion with the government, and we made it off, and then we will resolve those.
All right, I'm going to come back more on that, but I want to go to Caroline. Caroline, give us, Ron has presented, or?
No, certainly we are on the same line. The IMF, we are commending the Ukrainian government and the call for what achieved. Not enough, very broad, probably more probably. So energy and also money, because there is a lot of displaced people in the country, which is or board and actually, if I may call that, and it's more than a distraction, I would say, and at the same time go about these reforms that are very broad-based and that are also threatening to important parts of the Ukrainian economy. Because it's not as welcoming. There are people going to lose money on when the reforms are. Who is of course standing Ukraine firmly engaged by different programs, and what the Ukrainian economy up to improve its situation by being an economy that can compete on a global level and of law, corruption. So the business climate better, because without foreign investment, this is not happening in a vacuum. Ukraine has a very big neighbor. The EU and the US have hand in hand dealt with this political and geopolitical situation. What we can say for this Ukraine, now I think it's our time to administration with these sanctions.
I ask you about the IMF challenging that because IMF, the US, the EU, the EBRD has to continue in order to achieve that stabilization. So how do you see it in terms of financing? Should that be continued in order to ensure that these are locked in?
The different member states in the IMF have certainly their position on the board. IMF on is going to be, and it's the IMF in with that. From our point, need external it's very agile as it to be able to resist any shocks from the outside. That has on for example that economy.
Okay, I'm going to go because then I want to recite, come back to you, and then at around 11:30 come to the audience. You've taken a position and you've argued, just picking up on two here, the funding question, that it isn't a good.
Extraordinary. The IMF, European Union, Sweden for investment in Ukraine. Of course, not the case in any case. Admittedly, people are still not prosecuted, but at least they are hanged out in the media. And Ukraine is more open than any other country that is so corrupt. This is a strength for the country itself. And therefore, as Caroline rightly said, the EU and the IMF now think pretty much the same about Ukraine. They could explain US in Georgia, because Georgia did not have as good a discussion and as great a transparency as Ukraine has today. But it also brings a problem for foreign powers, because if you know all these corruption scandals, how can you justify to give money to these corrupt people? Rather than seeing it, this is our opportunity to tip the balance to the good people who have brought out all this dirt. So therefore, I think that we should take a different view of corruption scandals, and we should put a large amount of money on the table so that the good forces in Ukraine can win, and of course it should be conditional.
But that's the advice you're giving in these institutions, fighting in so they can make their case. What should they be doing in order to make a strong case for this continued financing?
Judicial reform, clean out the Prosecutor General's office. President Poroshenko is on his 4th Prosecutor General. No success so far. Something more needs to be done there. Judicial reform was legislated in June. Speed it up and get it done. It looks promising, but I'm not sure. And SPO, that what this issue needs to be clear. The positive side, I would like to, which is very relevant to
you this, and we'll on the same question have been the moving the in certain sectors.
It's very easy policy in the Ministry of Economy in terms of direct in some. Okay. So you need strong reforms.
It's like the EU. Well, you could say brought up to an EU level. That prepares you for the global market to sort of or not do it. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you have a trade with the word and interact with the word. And I think that is what is important.
But you're not worried about Ukraine fatigue, or are you? Anders used that term.
I think there is risk for fatigues of all sorts because the world is very complicated and there are very many conflicts that calls for EU attention. Everything from not giving up on Somalia, not situation and EU money, We are putting in huge sums now, of course, for sort of managing the migration situation, immigration situation outside EU's borders, in Turkey, for example, and in the countries that are to build up something that is now basically rubble. I mean, there's nothing left. And therefore, I would like to say again, you know, it's important that we have a United States that is not inward-looking, but feels that it needs to take its share of this, because the EU can't. Alternative, of course, if that, we wish to have for 40 million people. Yeah.
Okay. And Ron, do you have these points you might want to add in this mix?
I want to add, he made some businesses operating in Ukraine, both domestic businesses and international investors. And we always ask them, I mean, what do you want to change? What do you see as the biggest problem? And of course, I mean, the first thing that always comes up is corruption. Corruption is still always the most important issue that is seen as an obstacle to doing business in Ukraine. Followed closely, but less so in recent years, which has been another problem in the past. And I think there, I mean, we see that there have been improvements. In part, also what Anders was saying is that the society has become more open and more focused on this. I mean, there is a very, very strong civil society in Ukraine that is looking at this issue, particularly the issue of Ukraine. We also have established a good relationship with them to see, okay, what can we do in the context of the IMF program to deal with these issues. And there, I mean, if you traditionally look at IMF programs, I mean, these issues of corruption, judicial reform are for macroeconomic development in Ukraine. We have stepped into this but these have been successful reforms, and the implementation of the asset declaration was another measure. But what happens after that? And so there we run into what Anders was saying, the judicial reform. And yes, they adopted legislation in the summer to start this broader judicial reform. But the implementation of these institutions and the general application of the rule of law, that needs to be improved. I mean, we can do all these reforms, state-owned enterprise reform, energy sector reform, banking sector reform, whatever. Without the judiciary, I mean, it's still going to be difficult, and I think that's a critical one.
Okay. All right. I think all of you have really laid a good foundation for a dialogue. So let's go to you. Yes, and you'll have the first. And if you don't mind, please introduce yourself, and if you have a particular person up here who you want to answer your question.
Thank you. Ted Allers, former World Bank. I agree with what you said, all of you, about what has transpired in the last couple of years and the important things that have been done, the hard things that have been done. I agree on what needs to be done. Hear you right, I think I disagree on the prospects. As Ron said, Ukraine has lots of episodes of big, tough reforms during crises, and then really a halt. Many people would say that's a political economy issue. It's not about disagreement amongst economists and what would need to be done to have 6% growth instead of 2% growth. It's about vested interests that have really captured the state. And that so it's a political economy issue which has evolved, but not that. Privatbank, the generally haven't moved. So it's to happen to change that political economy, because it appears that those vested interests are as influential almost as ever.
Okay. Anders, I think you should take that.
Thank you, since I'm the greatest optimist, I guess, on the panel.
You did use that word. You were optimistic, so.
Yeah. I think that the answer is that this will be taken care of by corruption scandals, which will drive the political process to quite another extent than before. And my general argument is that if corruption is your main problem, you don't want political stability. Because political stability means that corruption, the vested interest, will survive. So you should see this as an iterative process. The three Baltic countries and Poland were on average every year during the first decade of independence. And in the West now, in particular here in Washington, you have a strong sense we must have political stability in Ukraine. No. It's better to have early elections. The people in power, the vested interest, warn us very strongly about populism. I'm much less afraid of populism in Ukraine, where people have proven quite sensible in most elections, than I am afraid of a vested interest. So let the political process work, and the Ukrainians know best how it should work without us in the West to understand Ukrainian politics much less, let it go. The economy we understand quite well, but the politics are much more difficult and local.
Okay, we're going to go to the gentleman at the, I apologize, sure, sure.
On this. And I mean, at the IMF, we're not the natural-born optimist like maybe Anders is, and we're always a little bit more cautious. But that being said, I mean, we also see reason for optimism, and it may be not just an issue of tackling, I mean, directly addressing the vested interest. What also has happened is taking away opportunities for corruption and opportunities for the vested interest to benefit from the situation that they had before. I mean, the energy sector is a key example where vast sums of monies were made by oligarchs by benefiting from the difference between international market prices and the tariffs that were charged domestically. Similarly, I mean, the government put in place an electronic procurement system, ProZorro, that has vastly reduced the scope for corruption in public procurement. So there are ways, even without having the judicial reform already that we all want so much, there are ways to reduce the opportunities for corruption and reduce the opportunities from vested interest to benefit from those.
I'm glad you commented, and forgive me, I thought maybe both of you maybe did, but please,
No,
go ahead, Caroline.
I just want to say also that the EU also understands very well, and we have invested earlier in anti-corruption. There was a new program signed for 15 million euros on an anti-corruption initiative for Ukraine to continue the reforms. And the association agreement and the free trade agreement, these are not short-term programs. That's not something we sign up for 2 years. This is a sort of long-term engagement with Ukraine. We are not going to abandon Ukraine. We invest in the future of Ukraine, and you need to be a bit optimistic for that as well. And we also, I think, and we never learn, that these reform processes, when it's going into market economy, whether it's to go into democracy, it's not something you do in 2 years. You don't do it. It takes generation, at least.
Okay. I promised the gentleman first back there, at the back of the room, and seated. Okay, and then we'll come up front. We'll move around.
Andrei Larian, Kate Institute. Just 4 points in a telegraphic style. 2 issues, I think, probably not the best way it has been described here. One is definitely, I would not consider what has happened in National Bank of Ukraine as a reform. It's maybe a demonstration more of traditional problem as corruption. National Bank, since June year 2014, since new leadership, has lost $9 billion as reserves. It's kind of lost assets over the last 2 years. Only 2 banks grew in assets. One is that is associated with the president, and another associated with the head of the National Bank International. I think it's a definitely good idea, especially if country in such a dire situation. But here's a problem. Already, share of debt to GDP is close to 90% of 90% of GDP. If Ukraine would receive, would be growing later. So that is why it's a good idea, but this idea could be a drug addiction for Ukraine. So that is why probably it's better to start growth, and if growth really good enough to support with financing after that.
May we try to get these
And 2 points that have not with such as it is has right level of it's 2 points because of the real actually fatigue or whatever, it's a Budapest fatigue. And Minsk cannot replace generally for the Western community to think about something that could really replace or create a new something, some kind of arrangement in security that could help and protect country from international or from foreign threat, and to allow to have a real economic growth.
All right, thank you. He put a very robust question forward. Who would like to begin? Would you like to, Ron, start this time?
Sure.
And maybe take pieces or all of it?
Yeah, no, first on the issue that I agree, but for economic reform, at least on distance from the European Union, is conditional on progress in economic reforms to get that economic growth that you would need to grow out of your debt problem. Indeed, the debt to GDP is estimated to end this year by about 86% of GDP. It will increase or steadily come. So the financing is conditional on the reforms that are needed to get the economic growth. So that's that issue. I totally disagree on that. If anything, we think that we strongly believe that the reforms pushed by the NBU are exemplary. The steps that they have taken in cleaning up the banking system have been tremendous, and we fully support those. Having established now an independent in the central bank adopting inflation targeting, having successfully reduced the rate of inflation from more than 60% to a current level of a little over 10%, and it's going to decline further next year. I mean, these have been remarkable achievements, and so we fully support the central bank.
What about the other 2 points raised, Caroline and Anders?
On the security, puts the country in a situation where it's also under pressure from the outside, and not a benevolent or positive pressure, but a negative pressure. We have not been much success, unfortunately. And I think today we are here a bit in a wait and see mood until we get all those, which one can discuss whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. But there has certainly been a lot of activity from State Department in trying to sort of, on the sidelines, help the Minsk process to move forward. But it's a part of a bigger game. So I think we have to, at this moment, we have to wait and see a bit. And there will be new energy coming on the rollover of the sanctions at the European Council tomorrow. I have not heard anything but that they will be rolled over. That's where we are.
And Anders?
Yeah, on the size of government, according to the IMF, it was 53% of GDP in 2014, which is indeed high West European level. According to the latest number, it is down now to 44% of GDP and falling. It should go down to 35%, but this is part of outstanding performance by Natalia Resko last year, and she particularly targeted corrupt expenditures which should not be there. In Ukraine, there's a special word for theft from the state budget, deriban. And this is what she hit, their financing. It's 80% of GDP. So the 90% you used is the IMF forecast, which did not come true because Ukraine has done better on the macroeconomics than the IMF anticipated. Ukraine has now seen the currency fall 3 times. So the dollar wages in Ukraine have fallen by 60% since 2013. We would expect a substantial appreciation of the currency, and almost all the public debt is now in foreign currency. So if you double the exchange rate, which is quite possible and likely in a few years, then you reduce the current public debt by half. If you on top of that have growth, it falls even more. So we have seen in other countries that have got growth, and then you get appreciation. Think of it that GDP.
We're going to take 2 questions, and then we're going to come back to you. And if the questions could be brief, it would be appreciated. Yes, you had your hand up, and then we're going to come to you. This gentleman in front here.
Thank you, Myron Rabi Dentons. I think from the viewpoint of Ukraine, now, you mentioned, Ms. Vicini, about a wait-and-see approach to the new administration in America. Mr. Oslin mentioned the reference to we needed on reforms, and we heard a lot about which is, I think, an aid to Ukraine, an effort to win the war of perception, both as reform is perceived in Ukraine and how Ukraine's efforts are perceived in the West. I think there is a failing on both counts, and my question to you would be, would you not feel, we appreciate that Ukraine needs to, not the facts, but Ukraine is suffering from a very bad perception of the EU and of Europe in that kicking the can on the Netherlands again, wanting to renegotiate the EU association agreement. I realize it's only other points, but the perception is that's on hold. That the voices in Europe as to cooperating with Russia, that sanctions are impeding business, and of course the view that the United States, that message to Ukraine is, we're on the cusp of abandoning you.
Okay, I think to you, this
that Ukraine is conducting right now were inspired by the revolution of dignity in Ukraine. And peace about that, about support, because Ukraine is fighting Russian aggression in the east, so I think wouldn't be kind of as an option when you mentioned kind of like one of the opportunities. The other thing is, I think, should be recognized that went through this process like Singapore or Poland have seen results much further during the road. What we get from the United States and from European Union. And I think Mr. Aslan's remark with regards to the tipping point and more assistance needed is very crucial. We really support this.
Okay, all right, thank you. Back to the question about image. Caroline Ron, would you like to, and Caroline in particular, I think that's for you, on the question about Ukraine's image impacting the EU, that the image is one that's negative.
The EU.
Correct, that's what his message was, and he was giving some examples.
Yeah, certainly. First of all, I must have been unclear in what I said. The wait and see when it comes is really regarding how we can solve the conflict in Ukraine, because I want to be very clear. Its right to its borders. A political solution has to be process. What the wait and see is to see what kind of attitude will we see from the new administration in the United States. I can't answer that question today, and if anybody here could help me to get an answer for that, I would be very, very happy. I can understand. I mean, because the US and the EU has worked hand in hand with Ukraine, and it's been a strong show of solidarity towards Ukraine. When it comes to the 2 issues you mentioned, the attitude or the referendum in the Netherlands on the accession agreement that has been worked out, sort of response to the internal domestic political needs in the Netherlands, but that does not change at all the agreement with Ukraine. So with that, we hope that the Netherlands will be able to ratify, as the 27 other countries have done already. So we get that, and the association already immediately. So there has been no delays in that. When it comes to the visa-free travel to the European Union, I think anybody considering the political situation in the EU after the migration crisis we have had during the last year or two, understands that, and anybody who has followed that in media understands that migration today is a very touchy and difficult topic to deal with on political level in the EU. And we have the free travel is really well under its way, and there are some technical issues to be resolved. There was a question of a mechanism how this visa-free travel agreement could be suspended if it was abused, and the sort of discussion had revolved around that. That is now basically solved, and we hope that in the near future we can offer visa-free travel for Ukrainians for short-term stays, for tourism to Europe.
I'm going to suggest we go to the floor again, and all right, we'll take your question. Gentleman over here. So there, the gentleman at the back, and the gentleman right there. And my apologies to others. If you make, please, brief questions, they will respond. We have a distinguished guest speaker who will be coming in via Skype.
This will be
have a
brief.
deadline.
Josh Cohen, I write independently on Ukraine for a number of years. Mentioned privatization as the biggest holdup. My own view, and I know you've been doing this for 25 years, is that sometimes there's too much of a, if there's enough, have the starting price at zero and, get rid of the asset. Just curious what you think and what the holdups are.
Okay, thank you for the brevity of your question. And the gentleman there, yes?
George for Ukraine has a lot of friends in the international community. It receives offers of help, excellent advice, like here in the previous panel. The problem is, in condition, these offers, condition is, as Dr. Oslin said, the basic problem is corruption. But I would say that this is corruption in a wider sense. It's macro corruption, because what's involved is the distortion, perversion, corruption of the mechanisms that would allow this advice and these offers of help to make a difference. And my question will be to the panel, what do you see as a way of possibly neutralizing, minimizing, if not removing, this corruption so that these mechanisms would be allowed to work? Okay. And you're just makes the forces that are resisting corruption much stronger than the reformers. And evidence of that is that several key reformers have resigned. You have the problem of the oligarchs that are pretty much, they think they're running the country and they are not interested in reform. More specifically, an area, the Donbass, which is a great irritant, and there is the local corruption of the leadership. There is the corruption on a lower level, criminality.
Sir, we're going to have to move to the next one. You've given
Okay.
a number of examples. Thank you.
All right.
And the gentleman back there, if you'll introduce yourself, and then we're going to the panel last.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Dirk Mathiasen, I'm a writer on Russian and Ukrainian affairs, also an optimist on Ukraine. Quick question, it's stalled. And, second question, I guess, for Mr. Van Ruden is any comment on Privatbank? Is it solvent?
Ron, why don't we begin with you? We'll just come down the line with our comments and responding to these points.
I mean, clearly, as always, I mean, we're not commenting on any specific banks. I mean, all I can say is that the central bank has been working diligently over the last couple of years in improving the health of the financial system. In that regard, it has discussed and agreed recapitalization and programs with the largest banks, including Privatbank, as well as related party export in the NBU on this.
Okay, thank you. Caroline?
No, I think I don't have any comments.
Anything to add? All right, then Anders?
Yeah, thank you. Josh Cohen, I completely agree with you. The main problem with the remaining state enterprises is that they cause corruption. They cause flows of corruption, and that's why privatization is stalled. So there are no real state enterprises. There's always somebody sitting on the pipe, as they say. And the question is to get those people away. Coming to the stalled privatization question in that context, I think that this was exactly the wrong way of handling a problem. West and Ost, $150 million. Would any foreign company, after having bought the company, pay $250 million to somebody who's wanted by Department of Justice? It's impossible. So therefore, no foreign company could participate under those conditions, and few at home would have the money, or if they would have the money, they would not want to be revealed. So what I think is sell off, what Ron essentially said at the beginning, sell off all the junk as fast as possible to get rid of it. Half of these enterprises are getting rid of corruption, then you will activate the market. With regard to foreign investment, Morgan Williams makes this point often that people are not prepared to invest in Ukraine today. FDI has essentially been zero in real terms since 2014 because of a war. Under Yanukovych, it was 4% of GDP each year, $6 to $8 billion. And now it's zero. In the statistics, you see some, but it's not real foreign direct investment. It's recapitalization of banks, which simply means that foreign banks transform their loans to subsidiaries in Ukraine to equity capital. And then it's so they don't go into the details. They say, we don't invest there because there is war. And that's it. On political corruption, yes, what we have not talked here about is the Rada. The Rada is a major problem. And the latest corruption scandal, Vyonyshenko scandal, deals exactly with this. So this is another part that needs to be. I think it's much more that Ukraine has gone back to the early 90s, that the big corruption is within the state, rather than involving the private enterprise. Forbes is top Ukrainian oligarchs' wealth. It has fallen by 2/3 in the last 2 years, suggesting that we are not doing much what people, because otherwise you have to mention names, and we don't want to mention names. I don't mention names. And while I think vested interest in state officials and parliamentarians, that's a more relevant discussion as the problem looks now.
Let me apologize again for those questions that we did not get to. I'm sorry about that. Please join me in thanking this panel for their comments. And I want to turn the
Let's introduce Aivaras Abramovicius with a few words. We are old friends for many years, and Aivaras has lived in Ukraine for 8 years. He was previously, for 20 years, a fund manager, and he knows really how Ukrainian and Russian enterprises work on the grassroots level. And for these good reasons, he became Minister of Economy on the 2nd of December 2014. And he got into certain trouble when a certain, not to be mentioned, senior parliamentarian asked him to appoint a deputy minister who would sit on the Naftagaz money flow. Instead resigns Minister of Economy. So it's Aivaras has done great things. He's behind the public e-procurement. He's behind substantial deregulation. He's behind substantial reform of state enterprise management. And he was also one of the people who was pushing very hard for the unification of energy prices. Aivaras, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Anders, for this kind introduction, and hello from Frosty Lasers, for I am appearing with Skype instead of in person. Unfortunate circumstances this time stood in the way between me and the DC, but I'm certain that I will see many of you in the future, both in the US and in Ukraine. And first of all, I want to thank Atlantic Council, personally Anders Ostlund and also Ambassador Herbst for friendship and also for support to myself, to Ukraine, and to the team of reformers that continue to push for the positive change in that country. 3 weeks ago, we were here, which was 16th per stage, including yours truly, 450 people in the audience, another 2,000 in the waiting list. And I looked at those people and I said, wow, what a great crowd of really bright, courageous, and true agents of change, among the young Ukrainians. Sadly, most have been sidelined by now, but their impact has been remarkable, in my view. In private business, if a CEO lets such a pool of talent go, he would have some grim consequences to face from the board. I was the first to speak, and I paid tribute to a phenomenal group of people, many of whom have left already government or central bank or various groups of reforms, but also to those that continue to make us proud and continue to serve the country. It would not have been possible without a great team that I eventually assembled. First and most important rule in recruiting those people was that anyone who has been in public administration before Maidan is not suitable for a top position in my government or in state-owned enterprises, so immediately got dismissed. Perhaps 10% of those dismissed would have been decent, but we had to go through some brutal lustration that we imposed ourselves within the ministry. So 700 people were hired, young Ukrainians, and with this type of team of agents of change, we embarked on quite a few interesting reforms. The most successful reforms in our ministry were certainly Prozoro, even though it was not even part of the coalition agreement. Within our own ministry, it was fourth in terms of priority. But thanks to very aggressive and positive and repetitive communications, among other things, we managed to basically achieve the most successful reform in Ukraine in the past 3 years. We started this reform in February 2015 when a kindergarten, in order to buy kilograms of paper, last week in Paris and in May in London, this system has received in the action, allow, if there is a political will, of course, to adopt the latest, the best. The quick train is about $12 billion a year. We estimated that 10% is stolen and 10% is inefficient procurement. So potential savings are to the tune of $2 billion a year. For a small economy of less than $90 billion a year, this is quite some substantial. Number two, so generously described, was the state-owned enterprise reform. 1,824 state-owned enterprises in operation, another 2,000 in a liquidation stage. In 2014, cumulative losses were $10 billion. Thanks to energy sector reforms, cleanup of Naftogaz, and just overall increase in transparency, CEOs imposed new rules of transparency. Losses were trimmed in 2015 to only $1 billion a year. CEOs for 3 main companies were chosen by nomination. 5 ministers and members, of which we had heads of World Bank, IFC, EB, director of nomination committee. So eventually we succeeded in selecting a Pole who was successfully transforming PKP Cargo, a railway company in Poland, for the post of railways. Ukrainian Post received a Boston Consulting Group alumni, Ukrainian from New York, and Ukrainian Gas Company received a McKinsey alumni, also Ukrainian who worked many years in the Middle East. Third, biggest reform for the was deregulation to conduct business activities were removed. 15,000 of Soviet ghost with that of EU or abolished altogether. And there were some individual things, easing of business conditions for exporters of grain, removing unnecessary quarantine certificate, expediting issuance of phytosanitarian certification in the port. Our team, but also by an excellent team of ministers, among whom I myself, but we also had, from their side. Micro stabilization for the entire government was goal number one, and that has been achieved. What we found was empty treasury, consecutive months of exchange rate fluctuation, 10% fantastic team at the National Bank of Ukraine, capital controls, currency controls, temporary import surcharge, not very popular things, but we had to put those in place, and we achieved macroeconomic stabilization from which a foundation is now being built for economic growth. So exchange rate is stable for a year and a half. Inflation peaked at 46% last year, is going to be 12% this year and 8% next year. Banks start to offer interest rates on loans that are lowest ever in Ukraine, to a certain extent because there is a lack of credible borrowers, but nevertheless dollars for the other mortals and so on. So growth is going to be 2% this year, take it or leave it, around 3% next year, but we all would have the middle path instead of choosing the breakthrough scenario. The two biggest reforms besides macroeconomic stabilization for the entire government have certainly been banking sector reform and energy sector reform. In both sectors, some in energy by Moldovans, Armenians, Lithuanians have done that, gradually over the last 25 years. Ukrainians have missed out on that opportunity. It's been over a year since we bought last time gas directly from Russia. So Gazprom has been sidelined, and we buy gas from the likes of RWE, Statoil, and Gaz de France. And of course, we five board members, 3 foreigners, all Brits with 100 plus years of experience from ConocoPhillips and British Petroleum of top positions, and they are in a majority of the board. Unfortunately, those are the only 3 independent boards of directors of the board. Sweden has 35 state-owned enterprises and over 300 independent board directors, so certainly a long way to go. And the banking sector, I heard Anders touched based on that a bit, but let me explain you how people got wealth in the banking sector. You set up a bank with $10 million in capital, you bring in $60 million in deposits, take those deposits through the back door through related party lending, go back to the central bank, ask for more refinancing for more millions of dollars, and take the back door. If I had bad luck, perhaps you would be a better owner from here on, so good luck and see you perhaps later. So over 80 banks in the last 2 years have been shut down, again, not because we wanted it or the fantastic team at the central bank wanted to do it, but because our predecessors have had a version of the reform process is slowing down considerably for obvious reasons. It's been 3 years since Maidan, there is a reform fatigue, there is still a war going on, populists are on the rise. Those that should have been in jail were quiet and scared at the beginning, but these guys are no longer scared nor quiet. Many are preparing for elections in 2 years once. Under these circumstances, Ukraine enters a more evolutionary stage of development. I call it a muddle through rather than the breakthrough that we all wished and we could have had. That still means that Ukraine needs all the international support it can get just to get through this vicious cycle of set that the country has been experiencing over the years. Things are actually slowly improving. Just before this call, I asked businesses around how do they see the situation now. And I would summarize it by the words of one of the gentlemen who said, that the situation is slowly moving out of the wherever you look at, mobile phone sales, car sales, events organizers, advertising, and so on, restaurants. Everyone is experiencing some sort of a small or slightly bigger improvement in business activities, many thanks to the stability that has been achieved, among other things. What's next? And let's discuss here what's next in the short term, because obviously in the long term, we all wish a lot of good things for Ukraine, including, rule of law and land reform and so on. Can we expect a land reform in the short term? No. There are no votes in the parliament for that. Let's be realistic. But obviously, majority of those that own land support the changes so that they have a right to sell the land that they got as a result of privatization. I heard some of you discuss privatization. Can we expect a newly found force? No. If you sell an asset for $100 million, your opponents would say, I would have sold this for $200 million. Is that politically, I do not rid of a single, I strongly doubt that. Then it brings us to the discussion, what can we really expect and where foreign partners can help in pushing for a change? I think majority of those require actually parliament support. So I would mention, I think 6. I can always mention more, but let's stick to 6 for now. First, reform of state fiscal service. I mean, tax administration and customs is still ancient and not modern. This agency needs to turn not into collecting taxes, but an agency of serving business. I always give an example, an Estonian state fiscal service, and their motto is, we're not here to collect taxes, we're here to serve the business. So the attitude change. Who's first? But has to stretch out a helping hand to the business first, rather than business needs to do something differently from what it does right now. And here I urge any type of foreign partners to support in changes happening in this organization, because this is where those changes may have the biggest impact on business activities in the country. Second, government reform. In last interview before he passed away, called the way the government meetings are structured worse than during the Soviet period. So the whole apparatus is absolutely out of date. And this does not require parliament to change. This was the biggest obstacle in our work, where we had to look from the 4th floor up to the 7th floor and pray that our initiatives end up in the government agenda. And once they end up in the government agenda, that, they're really discussed at the government meeting. And once, the decision is made collectively by all the ministers, that the Prime Minister signs it and the decree of the law, goes to the Verkhovna Rada. I mean, there are tons and tons of good examples around the procedures for the changes to happen. Third, public administration reform. There are many, many, many flaws in the current public administration reform, which went through, with a lot of sort of a controversy. But the biggest thing is that ministers and public servants still are paid close to nothing. Yet when you disclose the e-declarations, you realize that many of those fortunes on those cheap government servants cost us dearly in Ukraine. So the old system wants to cement the existing setup where there is no monetary, no financial incentive for the agents of change, for the young Ukrainians to join government services. This idea to public by drastic decrease of the number of bureaucrats. Modern technology allows that. When I fired 50% of the personnel, I expected demonstrations in front of the ministry. I expected court cases. None of them that has happened. When they saw the first salary slip with a 100% increase in salary, all these people emerged from their cells and they came to me and said, we can cut more. It's no problem, so to say, if you continue to increase our salaries. Fourth, continue with the state-owned enterprise reform certainly does not require anything more from the parliament. because all the necessary laws have laws as enough Ukrainian post for starters, but railways as a key sort of a focus, because railways is one of the largest railway companies in the world, $2.2 billion in revenue, and perhaps a good 30% is lost somewhere in transition. Enormous amount of financial industrial groups have interest there, and it has not really been transformed, even with the new CEO, because he has limited the powers, because the status of the company have changed, giving more powers to the inefficient board, which is mainly political appointees. Fifth, rule of law. I mean, we can talk about war, we can talk about every business, and foreign partners to support anything that relates to fighting corruption. So the two bureaus that have been established and the Agency of Prevention of Corruption, those guys are out in the cold by themselves. So they only have Ukrainian society, the grassroots movement, the civil activists, and the international partners. And as you see today, the most famous rock star in Ukraine, Slava Vakarchuk, sent a letter to President urging him to set up, which is obviously extremely corrupt sort of a court system in order to achieve some progress in fighting corruption. And six, continue with going to emerge after this reform with a much stronger banking system than we ever had. First week called up all the strategy from us, demands a government program for the year 2015. And he looked at me and said, you know these type of things, so why don't you, ministers, and we were full of energy, very enthusiastic. Obviously we wrote something. It was a good program. And Anders had a part in it. Since this was a very promising economy and lives and people would be inspired by it. So I said, I propose we call it an icebreaker. Stormy seas slowly but confidently breaking a very thick layer of ice, but certain that it will reach a final destination. Everyone agreed. There was lots of nods and claps, and then one elderly, very influential minister said, no, I'm against it. It's too radical. People, the program. I was disappointed, tried to convince my colleagues that people are more ready for radical changes than politicians are. In the end, they said, you go abroad, use icebreaker.ua, but here at home, we use it without any names. And I said, if we are not ready for radical names, I doubt that we're ready for radical reforms either. And that was, 2 weeks into my job. This year, the world, more than ever before, surprised us on multiple occasions. Disappointed, but hopefully made us stronger as well. We all good less scenarios to expect that this tendency would stop. No continuous path of transformation, but given all the external uncertainties, should do so with double the effort, without looking for shortcuts. There are no Orange Revolution, Yulia Tymoshenko is staging another comeback to a huge surprise of many. I believe that young, bright, progressive crowd of now.
And I think that